Welcome to Healthcare Upside Down with your host, Dr. Nick Vanterhaden, and brought to you by ECG Management Consultants. You can learn more about the show on the program's page at healthcarenowradio.com or on our blog at ecgmc.com/HUD. The U.S. spends more on healthcare per capita than any other country on the planet. So why don't we have superior outcomes? Why haven't the principles of capitalism prevailed? And why do American consumers have so much trouble accessing and paying for healthcare? Each week, Healthcare Upside Down will dive into these and other issues with ECG principal Dr. Nick and guest panelists as they discuss the upsides and downsides of healthcare in the US and how to make the system work for everyone. And we end with your better pill to swallow, the conclusion to today's episode with insights on challenges and changes that improve healthcare. Now here's your host, Dr. Nick.
The term burnout in science and experimentation refers to the reduction of fuel or any substance through the use of combustion. And in life, it takes on similar meaning, and the fuel here is our well-being and energy consumed by the work and experiences around us. We hear a lot about burnout in the news, and especially in the context of the pandemic that swept across our world, with healthcare staff experiencing high levels of stress, amplified by staff shortages, lockdowns, and the ongoing nature of the pandemic. In hindsight, I experienced my own version of burnout when I started work as a junior doctor, and my first shifts started on Friday morning at 9 a.m. and didn't finish until Monday evening around 5 p.m., some 80 hours later. That pace and demand did not let up, and the shift work and workload, what was termed a 1 in 2, was normalized by all of us as we found whatever coping mechanisms we had to mitigate the sheer exhaustion and fragility that it created. Coping with this, or resilience, is a psychological phenomenon, and it's not static. In other words, it waxes and wanes over time, depending on the circumstances you find yourself in. Much like firefighters who are protected by their fire-resistant equipment when they enter an inferno, their resilience is good. But if the pressure and heat persist, their equipment effectiveness will diminish in time. So too does our resilience and capacity to cope with stress. The good news is, resilience is something we can measure, and what you can measure, you can improve with the right treatments. We also know that healthcare staff are more resilient, but that resilience decreases, especially as we have seen with the persistent stress response that has become the norm in healthcare as we all endure the impact of the pandemic. How do we mitigate these pressures and turn the tide of burnout that has been impacting healthcare workers for many years? Join me on the Healthcare Upside Down show as I talk with Pennie Sempell, a former attorney, mediator, and a seasoned business and life coach and co-founder and CEO of StressPal, along with Jen Barna, a radiologist and founder and CEO of DocWorking. They've teamed up to launch an integrated approach of continuing education, peer support, and coaching to turn the tide and enhance clinician well-being. Hi, Pennie. Hi, Jen. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Nick.
Well, I'm excited to talk about this. This is a burgeoning subject. It's been amplified by the experience of the pandemic, but it goes back a long way. We're talking burnout and how to deal with burnout, but this is an individual problem, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting, Nick, how it is both an individual problem, and because it is such a pervasive problem, it has become an institutional problem as well.
And I'm going to jump in here and contribute to the concept that we all are aware of the enormous complex factors within healthcare that are driving distress and burnout. And these have been persistent. These have been going on for at least the last 10 decades, much worsened by this pandemic. So, how do we look at the individual piece and the institutional piece is a very big topic, and I hope we jump into it today.
So let's do that. How do we bring everybody to the table and start talking about this as a problem that is not just the individual, but actually resonates throughout the institution? And aside from getting everybody on the table, talking about it, we've also got to solve it. How do we approach this, Pennie?
Okay, well, I think we first need to start with some fundamental concepts. One of which that I think is important for us to remember is that there is a complex capacity in our brain to change its response to stressors. We often don't think about that. We think, well, the stress happens, there's all these external factors, they create there are adverse effects on us as human beings. We respond, we become worried, angry, we might skip meals, we might engage in all kinds of stress-triggered behaviors, and we think, well, that's just the way we respond. So looking at it from the individual perspective, I think what's really exciting is to look at what we can change, to be able to look at our own stress-triggered behaviors. And then how does that interface with these external events over which we have very little control?
But as I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about that as a clinician, and you're both clinicians as this, I go, well, I can recognize that. I can deal with that. Is that not the case?
Well, it's interesting that you say that as a physician, and I'm wondering about your experience as a physician too. I think a lot of us do. We are dealing with these symptoms of burnouts, and we've internalized it to an extent that often we are not even aware that we're feeling the effects of that. But what we're looking at, given all of the looming statistics of increasing burnout within the healthcare workforce, which was already a problem before the pandemic, and of course has just been exacerbated by that, is to recognize that there are steps that can be taken in terms of preventing burnout and to stopping burnout in its tracks before it gets to a point that it's a crisis for an individual, and that institutions can support their healthcare workforce in such a way that it actually can prevent burnout, which ultimately improves retention and improves, because it improves the culture of the institution. So we're looking at unique systems that can actually provide a lasting effect, much more so than a simple weekend workshop or, a short course that you take and then you're done. And that's what you walk away and that's the end of it. What we're interested in promoting, and we want to make sure that people understand when they're making decisions about how to support their healthcare workers, and that can be all the way from the front desk to the practicing physicians, that they provide a system that can retrain the brain, as Pennie is talking about, with beginning with fundamentals that put everyone on the same page, the cognitive skills that can help someone retrain their brain to interrupt stress responses while they're happening, and give them flexibility and resiliency, strengthening and protection of resilience, so that they can stay calm in even the most stressful situations, and take that skill set to the entire team with ongoing coaching support that will reinforce those skills over time, so that coaching support doesn't actually end. So what we're talking about is a really novel approach to give a lasting solution to our healthcare system in a time when we're really facing a crisis. The ultimate benefit to the organization, of course, is both institutional resiliency and improvement in retention, which is a very costly problem for our healthcare institutions.
So you bring up some interesting points, and I reconcile that with my history going through clinical training and reading Gray's Anatomy and the medicine tomes, and deciding that I had every disease on every chapter. But at the same time, importantly, you sort of reject that notion and say, well, that can't possibly be me, particularly as you extend through your career. I think that's true. So there's a lack of recognition. But there's the other thing that you point out here, which is this persistency of that stressor response that you talk about, Pennie. And, you know, how do we sort of reconcile that and start to manage that process so that we can interrupt it? Is that possible? It feels like it's just a never-ending cycle.
I think that's a two-pronged question, and one part of this is, you know, does science show that we can harness this high capacity that the brain has for symbolic thought? That is in fact the capacity for symbolic thought that gets us into the stress response. But harnessing that, we can also learn these cognitive, behavioral, and physical strategies that help us to change our stress response and to be able to have that control, an area of control, and I want to say importantly, making choices that are aligned with what we value. So at the leading intervention strategies that have been well studied in the fields of psychology, psychoneuroimmunology over the last 2 decades, show that there is this very significant capacity, even with brief education, brief training, interactive experiential training, to increase your brain's capacity to make this change aligned with what's important to you. Now, how does the other prong of this is that there are these enormous external stressors. And yet in the healthcare setting, it is the individuals within that setting that are the only ones who are going to be able to change that. So I come from a conflict resolution background, and how do people from very opposing, sometimes hostile, tense positions, as we know exists in healthcare, with different needs and different directions that they're going through, how do we find that place to effectively communicate and collaborate? Well, as we develop our own internal capacity to change our stress response and to be aware of stress-triggered responses in others, we are better able to have those interprofessional communications and collaborations. And this is right where I see these coming together. So you put education together with this support, this peer support, this coaching that's there, right there in an accessible way. And of course, we're talking here about digital health, because we don't have the capacity to provide these services one-on-one, right? There just aren't enough behavioral health therapists out there. But we can bring these principles and these teachings into a format, to make it accessible.
So you bring up an interesting point there relative to the length of time. You talk about you can do this with short interventions. What does that mean? What is a short intervention that's effective based on the science?
Based on the science, the different studies are looking at a period between 4 to 6 weeks. I think maybe some 4 to 8 weeks, no more than less than an hour, even a week. So brief, even a couple of minutes of information that you then personalize and you practice, you just reflect on in your day. You're provided with you layer that. So this is brain-based learning is how we learn to change any habit, little bits over not that brief period of time, for like 4 to 8 weeks, something in that period. But then of course you want ongoing support, right? You want to refresh yourself, to be reminded. And that's where this, as Jen is talking about, across the enterprise approaches, you want to be looking for intervention tools or programs that provide that ability for the cohorts to reinforce among each other, to be able to have conversations and remind each other and support each other around these subtle but very powerful changes that we can make.
But that's all great. I hear that. And I go, well, that doesn't seem like a long time. But my experience with medical students, that's been very personal for me as I tried to sort of navigate that. And, to your points here, this is not about sort of treating it. This is actually prevention. When I tried to introduce that in a medical student setting, I was told, not a chance I have. I don't have enough time for that. How do we go about approaching this to get this so that it becomes prevention and actually more broadly rolled out? I think it's beyond just the clinicians at this point.
I think that's a great point, because every physician I feel like that I've spoken with over the past several years has said, I need this, I want this, but I don't have time for it. And that's one thing that I think is critical, is that, to have a system, which is what, what we're talking about, is a system that is designed specifically to accommodate that type of schedule, where you're talking about already coming in with a sense of overwhelm and feeling like, okay, I can spend 5 minutes on this week. And there's some relief in that idea, to know that, number one, there's not a deadline. You can do this on your own time. You can come in and spend 5 minutes, 1 minute of which, you might go over to that community platform where you're interacting with coaching, a coaching team, as well as peers in your profession. So physician to physician across the country, or PAs and nurse practitioners in their own group across the country, similar with medical students and the whole care team for nurses and techs. So when you're knowing that even with your time constraints, you can come in and make a difference for yourself simply by starting with 5 minutes a week, we've prepared, it's important, and it makes it approachable and leads to long-term solutions to be able to come in and have really small bite-sized pieces that you can take a little bit at a time. And as you get going, you can potentially increase that if you choose to. But the idea of the ongoing support is to accommodate a long-term learning process that doesn't have to happen overnight. But once it happens, it's more of a permanent process. And the other thing that I think is really important that Pennie mentioned or alluded to was just the idea of the individual being able to direct their own burnout prevention and protect their resilience, because we already know healthcare workers are more resilient than the average population. So what can we do to strengthen that resilience for individuals? And in doing that, it's not putting the responsibility of the problems of the whole system on the individual. What it does is it's designed to empower the individual so that they can then affect the change that's needed in the whole culture overall, because we do have a number of, obviously systemic problems in the healthcare culture. So by protecting individuals in this kind of way and supporting them so that they can feel purpose in coming to work every day and leave behind the sense of overwhelm and be in control of, recognize what they can control and be in control of their own lives, that empowers them to then come around and be at the table to affect change for the whole system.
I think that's fantastic, and it's an old adage, but, every journey begins with one small step. It doesn't matter, how small that step is. You talked a little bit about the extension and the supporting infrastructure within the community, despite the fact that healthcare is more resilient, which to me is interesting in its own right. I don't think we've got time to sort of dive into that. We still struggle with that, and we struggle with conflict resolution. How do we approach that to satisfy everybody and get everybody at the table in a way that moves us in the same direction, as opposed to what seems to be happening as people are sort of, falling across into this binary or, further diversification of views?
I'm going to jump in here. I think that leading further here in the conversation, one phrase comes to mind: protected time. If organizations see as a priority that they are providing protected time, a little bit of time, maybe every day, 5-10 minutes every day for their teams. I'm not across the enterprise, that this is valued and important and part of the culture of the organization, and that everyone in the organization knows that they're taking that time for themselves is valued by the organization, and on the bottom line for the organization, this is going to reap a very good return on their investment, because attrition is a serious problem. If people feel protected, if they feel that they're given time, meaningful time for themselves, and they're given valuable tools and educational tools, coaching support, peer support. These are some of the key elements that research has shown are very valuable to individuals to rebuild their relationships, to diffuse tension, to de-escalate the stress response. These are all well-studied methodology, and they can be brought together, and that's a very exciting piece that Jen and I have independently been working on, is how we bring together these science-based approaches that we know help diffuse distress and build resilience.
Such an important point, and for me it's amplified by you get what you incent, and I would go actually a step further and say, this is not just protected time. Why is this not an actual target for organizations, for them to say, we expect this and we're going to measure it, and we want to see in the same way that we measure productivity? Because as you talk, Jen, you mentioned that whilst there's a cost, and I sort of struggled with who's going to pay for it, it actually potentially has value, because you're going to improve your workforce, get better productivity potentially, and you're going to retain staff that, if we believe the press, they're all leaving. So you're struggling with that. Is that the case?
Yeah, so it is the case, and there are regulatory benefits to providing these programs as well. So the regulatory benefit, in addition to the retention benefit of holding on to employees, 39% of physicians polled recently reported a lack of respect from administrators and employers and colleagues as being a major contributor to their burnout. And that type of supportive atmosphere can contradict that and help physicians to feel less burnout and want to stay with an organization. So putting these types of systems into place does pay for itself in terms of decreasing the extremely high cost of losing healthcare professionals. And in the current environment and what's coming, as 25 to 30% of physicians are reporting considering leaving the profession altogether, and 54% of them are reporting planning to change jobs. Those statistics are stunning. And so the healthcare organizations that are providing this type of ongoing support, I think, are going to be the ones who succeed in an environment of shortage of healthcare workers that's coming.
Well, so the good news is that we have solutions. We've got essentially tools that are able for us, not just as a post-treatment, but actually a prevention. They can help solve the problem. There is no better employee or hire than the person that stays with an organization. It's very costly to sort of retrain, bring people in. I would suggest that the incentives need to be built in, not just making time, as you rightly point out, Pennie, but actually building in an incentive program. And I'll close with saying that this whole conflict resolution doesn't seem to be just for healthcare. I think we need this worldwide, quite frankly. So maybe this isn't just healthcare, but we should start there. Thank you both for joining me on the show today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for having us. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Solving for burnout is not just an individual problem, but is rather an institutional and perhaps even a societal problem that requires everyone to be engaged in fixing it. It requires an institutional response that not only creates protected times, but creates corporate and broader incentives that measure and reward improvements in resilience in their staff. The cost of solutions pay for themselves when you consider the large swathes of people who are considering leaving, or worse, have already left. If you're looking for an ROI for investing in a resilience program, look no further than the savings accrued from not only keeping staff in their roles, but making them happier and, as a direct consequence, more productive. Your better pill to swallow is to create a preventative resilience program to diffuse the widespread distress and burnout. But go one step further and seek to create more resilience before those problems even arise. Every journey starts with a single step, and that could be a small amount of protected time for your community to engage in programs that retrain the brain towards resilience. But you can and should go further by developing beyond and allowing and moving to incentivize the resilience, not just for the clinical staff, but for every member and contributor to the team. Your clinicians will thank you, as will your staff and patients, and that program extends to everyone, including you. Thanks for joining me, your host, Dr. Nick, on this week's edition of Healthcare Upside Down. Until next week, keep solving the business of healthcare as if your life depended on it, as one day soon, it will.
That's all the time we have for today. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite listening platform by searching for Healthcare Now Radio. Also, check out our blog at ecgmc.com/HUD for summaries and commentary from each episode. Follow our show's social hashtag, HCUpsideDown. And join us each week as we work to solve the business of healthcare for everyone.